The corner of 142nd Street and 8th Avenue in Harlem sits in the middle block of a neighborhood that has always understood itself as the center of something. It is not a modest geography. Harlem has never produced modest self-assessments, and the men who came of age on its blocks in the middle decades of the 20th century, in music, in politics, in literature, in the daily performance of dignity under conditions designed to deny it, understood their neighborhood as a place of consequence. By the mid-1980s, that inheritance was carrying more weight than any community could sustain without fracturing. The jobs that had anchored the working-class families of Central Harlem had been leaving for a decade. The institutions that had held the community's social structure in place, the ballrooms, the small businesses, and the manufacturing plants north of 125th Street, were closing or had already closed. What remained was the infrastructure of a community and the memory of what that infrastructure had once supported, straining against the pressure of what the present had become. Richard Porter was born into this Harlem in 1965. The specific details of his earliest years are not extensively documented in the public record, and any account of his childhood that claims precision beyond what is documented would be inventing facts that do not need to be invented to tell the story honestly. What is documented, through the accounts of people who grew up alongside him, through the journalism that followed his death, and through the cultural record that his story produced over the subsequent decades, is that he was a young man of evident intelligence and social acuity who came of age in a neighborhood where those qualities had a limited number of channels through which to develop into something lasting. He was not alone in this condition. The Harlem of the early 1980s was producing a generation of young men whose capabilities outpaced the opportunities available to them with a consistency that the community's institutions had no adequate mechanism for addressing. The schools were underfunded. The employment available to young black men in New York City in the early 1980s was, in the neighborhoods north of Central Park, neither plentiful nor particularly promising. To the formal economy's ceiling for an ambitious young man from 141st Street in 1983 or 1984 was visible and low. This is not offered as an excuse for the choices that followed. It is offered as the context without which the choices cannot be honestly understood. The humiliation that marked the beginning of the specific arc this story traces did not arrive in a single dramatic confrontation. It arrived in the accumulated experience of a system that had organized itself to produce a certain outcome, regardless of what an individual brought to it. The specific incident that most clearly captures this accumulated weight, documented in accounts from individuals who knew Porter during this period, involved a job application process, or its equivalent, and in which a young man of demonstrable ability was evaluated not on that ability, but on the address that appeared on his application and the zip code that address implied. The details of the specific incident are not documented with enough precision to report with certainty. What is documented, through the consistent account of people who knew him and the broader documented pattern of employment discrimination against young black men in New York City during this period, is that the experience of being assessed by category rather than capability was not theoretical for Richard Porter. It was the repeated texture of a system he encountered at every formal junction. He did not respond to these experiences with visible anger. This quality, the absence of performed emotion in response to institutional dismissal, was noted by multiple people who knew him during his early years. He was, by their accounts, a young man who processed difficulty inwardly and emerged from the processing with decisions rather than expressions. The people who later studied him as a figure, and the people who simply knew him as a neighbor, both described the same fundamental characteristic: a composure that was not the absence of feeling, but the discipline of a man who had decided that visible feeling was not a useful response to the conditions he was navigating. He walked away from the formal economy with the specific quietness of someone who has finished evaluating an option and concluded that it does not serve his purpose. The withdrawal was not dramatic. There was no confrontation with an employer, no public statement, no moment of visible rupture. He simply redirected his attention. The energy and intelligence and organizational capacity that the formal economy had declined to develop became the founding assets of a different enterprise entirely. The realization that preceded this redirection was not, in Porter's case, a sudden insight. It was the conclusion of a period of observation and analysis that people who knew him date to the early 1980s, when crack cocaine had not yet arrived in Harlem in quantity, but when the drug economy's basic logic, supply, distribution, margin, territorial control, was already visible in the heroin trade that had shaped Harlem's informal economy for the preceding 2 decades. Porter understood. And before crack transformed the specific economics of street-level drug distribution, that the drug trade operated as a distribution system whose fundamental principles were not unlike those of any other distribution system. It had suppliers and distributors and retailers. It had quality differentials and price points and customer relationships. It had the same logic of organizational control determining who captured value at each stage of the supply chain. What crack cocaine did when it arrived in Harlem in volume between 1984 and 1986 was transform the scale of what those organizational principles could produce. The product's price point, dramatically lower than powder cocaine, accessible to a customer population vastly larger than the powder market had ever reached, and its addictive characteristics created a retail demand whose density and consistency had no precedent in the street-level drug economy. The organizations that were positioned to serve that demand with reliability, quality, and territorial discipline accumulated wealth at a rate that the previous generation of Harlem drug figures had not experienced. Richard Porter understood this transformation earlier than most of the young men around him and positioned himself to take advantage of it with a deliberateness that his subsequent trajectory documented clearly. The coalition he built was small and specific. Its most important members were Anthony Littman, known throughout Harlem as AZ, and Alberto Martinez, who went by Alpo. These 3 names would eventually become so intertwined in the Harlem street mythology of the late 1980s that they were spoken together as a kind of shorthand for the era itself. They were, in the years of their partnership's formation and early operation, young men whose complementary qualities made the combination more durable and more effective than any of them would have been individually. This is the consistent account of people who observed their partnership from the outside, including journalists and community members whose recollections have been collected across decades of reporting on Porter's story and its aftermath. Aziz's importance to the coalition was organizational. He was, by the accounts available, a careful thinker whose approach to the operational questions of distribution, supply management, territorial discipline, worker reliability, complemented Porter's more public-facing strengths. The specific division of responsibilities between them is not documented in the kind of detail that would support a precise operational description, and any such description that claimed precision beyond what the available record supports would be inventing facts. What is documented is that their partnership functioned as an organizational unit rather than merely as a social arrangement, and that its early results justified the structure they had built. Alpo Martinez's importance to the coalition was of a different kind, and it is the kind that makes his ultimate role in the story's ending among the most consequential facts in it. He was, by the accounts of people who knew all 3 men during this period, the member of the partnership whose capacity for the violence that any drug distribution enterprise in a contested urban territory required was most immediately apparent and most readily available. This is not, in itself, a moral judgment. In the specific operational environment of Harlem's crack distribution market in the mid-1980s, the ability to project credibility around territorial enforcement was a genuine business asset. Organizations that could not credibly defend their distribution territory did not retain it. Alpo Martinez's presence in the coalition provided, among other things, a credibility of that specific variety. What people who knew all three men also note, and what the events that eventually ended Porter's life make impossible to ignore as a contextual fact established early in the partnership, is that the quality that made Alpo Martinez an effective enforcer was not a quality that could be entirely separated from its possessor and applied only to organizational purposes. The violence was not, in other words, a tool that sat in a drawer between uses. It was a characteristic of a man, and the man was a partner in an enterprise whose interests, at some future and unpredictable point, might not align with the interests of the partnership's other members. The strategy that Porter developed and executed across the second half of the 1980s operated on two levels simultaneously, and the relationship between those levels is what distinguished his organization from the many others operating in the same geography at the same time. The first level was operational. Porter ran a crack distribution network that occupied territory in central Harlem, the specific blocks around 141st Street and extending through portions of the neighborhood, with a discipline and a product consistency that built customer loyalty in a market where consistency was not universal. The specific mechanics of his supply chain, who his wholesale sources were, what the organizational structure below his level of management looked like, how the revenues moved from street-level sales back through the organization, are not fully documented in the public record. What is documented, through the accounts of people who observed the operation from the outside and through the subsequent investigations that followed his death, is that the enterprise was generating revenues of a scale consistent with a major market position in one of New York City's most active crack distribution territories. The second level was relational, and it is this level that most clearly explains why Richard Porter's name has persisted in Harlem's memory across 3 decades, while the names of other organizations that operated at comparable scale during the same period have not. He treated the community whose streets his organization occupied as something other than a customer base to be exploited. This distinction, where it existed at all among the crack era's major operators, yet was unusual enough to produce a community relationship of genuine depth. He was generous with money in ways that the neighborhood observed and remembered. He purchased Christmas gifts for children in the community. He funded informal assistance for families in the neighborhood who were facing emergencies of the kind that Harlem's most economically distressed residents faced with a regularity that no institutional mechanism adequately addressed. He appeared at community events. He knew the names of elderly residents on the blocks his organization served and treated them with a consistent respect that was noticed and that produced, in the community's informal social accounting, a credit balance whose size is reflected in the persistence of his name in neighborhood memory. This generosity was not, in the historical record, and a calculated public relations strategy of the kind that a sophisticated operator might deploy to build goodwill as a protection against community cooperation with law enforcement. It appears, based on the accounts of people who knew him, to have been a genuine expression of his understanding of his relationship to the neighborhood. He was from Harlem in the specific and complete sense that the phrase implies for someone who has no other geography of belonging. The community whose streets he was occupying was not an abstraction or a market. It was the only place that had ever been his, and the way he engaged with it reflected that understanding. He was also visibly successful in the specific way that the crack era's major operators express success: through clothing, through cars, and through the physical presentation of prosperity whose visibility in the community served a dual function. It communicated organizational status to the competition. It communicated to the neighborhood that wealth was possible, that a young man from 141st Street could accumulate it, that the formal economy's assessment of what a Harlem kid could achieve was not the only assessment that mattered. The furs and the cars and the designer clothing that Porter wore during the height of his organization's operation have been described in dozens of accounts over the decades since his death. And what those accounts consistently note is not the clothing itself, but the effect it produced. The specific quality of attention and regard that his physical presence commanded in the neighborhood he moved through. This was power. Not the crude power of physical intimidation, though that dimension was present in the organization and was exercised when the operational environment required it. This was the more durable power of genuine community standing, the accumulation of enough trust, enough reciprocity, enough visible identification with the neighborhood's interests to produce a social authority that operated independently of whatever law enforcement pressure might be directed at the organization at any given time. Informants are produced by community members who are willing to cooperate with law enforcement. And community members are more willing to cooperate when the organization they are being asked to cooperate against is experienced as hostile to their interests. Porter's organization was not experienced that way. This was not an accident, yet it was the consequence of a deliberate approach to community relationship that distinguished his operation within the landscape of Harlem's crack distribution economy. By 1987 and into 1988, the three-part organization that Porter anchored at its public face had achieved a market position in central Harlem that was, by the accounts of people who observed it during this period, genuinely significant. The specific dollar figures attached to the organization's revenues during this period vary across different accounts and have not been established with precision by any judicial or investigative record available in the public domain. What is established, through the consistency of multiple independent accounts, is that the scale was large enough to support the lifestyle Porter was publicly displaying and to generate the kind of community economic presence, the employment of workers, the purchasing of goods and services in the neighborhood, the informal wealth distribution that his generosity represented, that communities in distress notice and respond to. The neighborhood watched this rise with the mixture of complicated emotions that any crack-era drug organization produced in the communities it occupied. There was the anxiety and the fear, the knowledge that the organization's presence brought violence into the neighborhood, that the product it sold was destroying families, that the young men working at its edges were being drawn into an enterprise that the formal justice system would eventually address in ways whose consequences would be paid over decades. These were real costs, and the people who absorbed them experienced them as real. There was also, alongside these things and not canceling them, a genuine pride of a complex and problematic variety. Rich Porter was from Harlem. He had taken nothing the formal economy had offered him because the formal economy had offered him almost nothing. He had built something significant with the intelligence and the organizational capacity and the social acuity that the neighborhood had produced in him. That something was illegal and was causing harm. It was also, in the specific and painful terms of the crack-era street economy, visible evidence that a young black man from 142nd Street could command resources and build an operation of genuine consequence. The community held both truths simultaneously, because the community did not have the luxury of resolving the contradiction into a simpler narrative. The execution phase of Porter's organizational strategy, the years between approximately 1985 and 1989, when the operation ran at its most effective, demonstrated the consistency of the approach he had built. The product quality was maintained. The territorial discipline was enforced. The community relationships were cultivated. The wealth was displayed in ways that communicated stability and success. The organization grew in the way that organizations grow when their fundamental model is sound, through the addition of capacity without the destruction of the principles that made the capacity valuable in the first place. The law enforcement environment surrounding the organization during these years was active, as it was throughout Harlem during the crack era, but the specific operational intelligence that would have been necessary to build a prosecution targeting Porter specifically was not assembled during the years of his operation. The reasons for this gap in law enforcement attention are not fully documented in the public record. What is documented is the absence of a federal indictment against Porter or his immediate partners during the years of their operation's peak. An absence that, given the scale the organization had reached, reflected either a gap in investigative attention or a gap in the intelligence available to investigators, or some combination of both. The first significant fracture in the organization's operational stability came in a form that no strategic planning could have anticipated and no organizational discipline could have prevented. In December 1989, Richard Porter's younger brother, Donald Porter, known in the neighborhood as Doo-Wop, was kidnapped. The kidnappers demanded a ransom. The specific amount demanded and the specific amount paid are reported differently across different accounts, and the version of events that is both most commonly reported and most consistent across independent accounts holds that a ransom payment was made by Richard Porter. The payment was made. Donald Porter did not survive. What this event meant for Richard Porter, the specific quality of what it cost him internally, the way it changed his relationship to the enterprise he had built and the city he operated in, is not documented in the way that his organizational history is documented. He did not give interviews. He did not produce a written account. What the people who knew him and observed him during the weeks following his brother's death describe is a man who was carrying something that visibly changed him, who moved through the neighborhood with a grief and a weight that the composure he had always projected could not entirely contain. The identity of Donald Porter's kidnappers is a matter that has been reported with varying degrees of specificity across different accounts. On the specific details of who was responsible for the kidnapping and its fatal conclusion are not established in any judicial record available in the public domain, and reporting those details as established fact would require a certainty the available record does not support. What is established in the historical record, through subsequent reporting, through the accounts of people who knew the relevant parties, and through the judicial proceedings that followed, is what happened to Richard Porter himself in January 1990. He was murdered. He was 24 years old. The man who killed him was Alberto Martinez, Alpo, his partner. The precise circumstances of the killing are not fully detailed in the public record in ways that would support a complete account, and the specific motivation that led Alpo Martinez to kill the man he had built an organization alongside is a matter on which the accounts that exist are not entirely consistent. What is not disputed is the fact of the killing, the identity of the person who committed it, and the age of the person who died. Alpo Martinez was eventually arrested and entered into a federal cooperation agreement. He provided information to federal prosecutors about his own organization's activities, which extended well beyond Harlem into Washington, D.C. The cooperation agreement produced a sentence significantly below what his conduct would otherwise have generated. Yet he was eventually released from federal custody and was murdered in New York City in November 2021. A fact that the people of Harlem received with a range of responses that reflected how completely his betrayal of the partnership's code and his role in Richard Porter's death had defined his standing in the community's moral accounting across the 3 decades since. The legacy of Richard Porter is not the kind of legacy that resolves into a simple instruction. It does not teach a single lesson whose application is straightforward. It teaches several things simultaneously, and the several things do not all point in the same direction. It teaches, first, see about the specific vulnerability of any organization built on personal loyalty in a system where the pressures that produce betrayal are real, and where the mechanisms for addressing those pressures without violence are limited or absent. Porter built his organization on relationships, with AZ, with Alpo, with the community whose streets he occupied, with the workers whose livelihoods depended on the enterprise's stability. Relationships are the strongest and most durable foundation for organizational trust, and they are also the point of maximum vulnerability when the interests that sustain them change. His death at the hands of his closest partner is the most extreme possible demonstration of this vulnerability. It teaches, second, about the specific cost of building power in a system that has no legal infrastructure for protecting it. Porter accumulated wealth and community standing and organizational authority of genuine scale. None of it, not the money, not the relationships, not the organizational position, could be protected through any mechanism that the formal legal system would recognize. The drug economy's extra-legal character meant that the enforcement of agreements, the protection of assets, and the resolution of disputes all had to occur through channels whose violence-adjacent character was a permanent feature rather than an aberration. The kidnapping of his brother and his own murder were not departures from the system he had built. They were its logic, applied to him. It teaches, third, about the relationship between genuine community standing and the survival of memory. The men who operated at comparable scale in Harlem during the same period, whose names appear in the same investigations, whose organizations occupied adjacent territory, whose operations generated comparable revenues, are not remembered the way Richard Porter is remembered. The difference is not the scale of the enterprise. It is the quality of the relationship to the community. Porter's generosity was real. His regard for the neighborhood was real. The community recorded it and has preserved the record across more than 30 years without institutional support, without a monument, without the formal apparatus of commemoration. The preservation has been entirely informal, in the stories people tell, yet in the way his name comes up in conversations about that era, in the cultural productions that his story eventually generated. The 2002 film Paid in Full, produced by Rockefeller Films and based on events from Porter's life and the lives of his partners, brought the story to a national audience that had not been present on 142nd Street in 1987. The film changed certain facts, compressed others, and added dramatic elements whose relationship to the documented record varies. What it could not change was the fundamental architecture of the story. A young man of genuine intelligence and capability, operating in a system that the formal economy had excluded him from, building something significant in the only system available to him, and being destroyed by the vulnerabilities that system made inevitable. That architecture is the one the neighborhood had already preserved for 12 years before the film articulated it. The film's reception, its commercial success, the consistency with which it is cited in discussions of the crack era's human texture, reflects how accurately it captured something that people who had not been in Harlem in the late 1980s recognized as true. The zero-to-hero arc of Richard Porter's story does not end where the template requires it to end. There is no durable victory. There is no behavioral change in the opposing power. There is no legacy of systemic reform. The story ends at 24 years old, in January 1990, in Harlem, with a young man's death at the hands of a partner. That is the ending, and it is not a redemption. What is present in the story, and what the template structure can illuminate even in a case where the conclusion does not conform to its expectations, is the movement from nothing to something that the middle portion of the arc represents. Porter began with no institutional recognition, no formal opportunity, no legitimate channel through which his considerable capabilities could develop into something lasting. He built, through intelligence and organizational discipline and genuine community relationship, a position of real consequence. The position was temporary. The method of its construction was illegal and harmful. The ending was violent and premature. None of this cancels the movement that occurred between the beginning and the end. He was underestimated, and he outperformed the estimate. He was excluded, and he built something that could not be excluded from the neighborhood's regard. He was operating in a system designed to produce his destruction, and he operated effectively within it for 5 years before the system delivered exactly the destruction it was designed to deliver. Harlem has remembered him for more than 3 decades, not because the story is simple or because its lessons are clean, but because it is the most honest account the neighborhood has of what happens when genuine capability meets a closed system and makes the only calculation available to it. The calculation is wrong in its fundamental premises. The consequences of it are real, and they are paid by people who do not choose to pay them. The intelligence and the discipline and the community care that Richard Porter brought to an enterprise that should have had no claim on those qualities are not redeemed by the enterprise's illegitimacy. They are simply present in the record, alongside the harm and alongside the ending, refusing to be erased by either. That refusal, the persistence of his name in the neighborhood's memory against the weight of how his story concluded, is the most accurate measure of what he built during the years he had. He built a kind of regard that outlasted him in a community that had every reason to forget the men who exploited it and chose, in his case, not to forget. The distinction the community drew was real. The basis for it was real. The persistence of it, across 35 years and into the present, it is the only form of victory the story contains. It is not enough. It is what is there. The corner of 141st Street and 8th Avenue is still a corner. The neighborhood around it has changed in the ways that Harlem has changed across the decades since his death. The waves of investment and displacement. The renovation of buildings that stood empty when he walked past them. The arrival of residents whose economic position gives them a different relationship to the neighborhood's geography than the one his generation occupied. The men who remember him are older now. Some of them are gone. The stories they carry are being passed to people who were not there, who know the name from a film or from a conversation with someone older, who hold it with the specific lightness of inherited memory rather than the specific weight of direct experience. Yet the inherited memory does something that the direct experience could not do. It removes the complications of proximity, the fear that his organization generated, the harm that his product caused, the grief of his brother's death and his own, and reduces what remains to the outline of the arc. The young man who began with nothing, the organization he built, the community that received him as something other than a criminal, the ending that came too soon and too violently and at the hands of the person least expected, the 35 years of memory that followed. The outline is not the whole truth, but the outline is what persists, and what it preserves is the part of the truth that the formal record, the criminal files that were never completed, the prosecution that never occurred, the judicial record that documented only the aftermath, was not designed to hold. What the neighborhood held instead is what always outlasts the official account. The memory of a young man who, for a few years in the late 1980s, moved through Harlem as though the closed system that had produced him had not set the ceiling he was supposed to accept. He did not accept it. The consequences of that refusal were devastating and terminal and entirely foreseeable in retrospect, And none of that has diminished, across all the years since, the regard in which his neighborhood holds the refusal itself.